This is it. This is the greatest tier list of all time. Well, literally, because we ranked every class on a greatest of all time list. Look, we're about to have a major patch, and the game will be changing a lot. Then next year, we'll have a brand new expansion. And if there's one bet that we are 100% willing to make, it's that some classes will still be good no matter what, while others might struggle. But how do we know who's going to be the guaranteed GOATs and who will be the biggest gambles? Let's find out. And if you're looking to play something new next season, remember that WoW PvP is honestly a lot like cooking. But you don't want to be that guy getting flamed every game for doing 0 damage. If you're sick of being hard stuck in Hell's Kitchen, you need to check out our brand new courses on how to counter every class in WoW. Skill Cap members even get a world-first complete 2-in-1 UI, which has been optimized to reduce tunnel vision and increase damage. Everything we offer is designed to get you the rating you deserve by teaching the fundamentals that actually carry, like damage rotations, burst sequences, openers, and more. And no matter what, we will back you up with a rating gain guarantee, where we promise that you will see rating gains while actively using our website. So after this video, be sure to click the link below for an exclusive discount to get started. For now, back to the video. There is one main rule we're going to follow for making this list. In order for a spec to always be good, it needs to have a good toolkit. What this means is having mechanics that don't get consistently nerfed or buffed every patch. These can include mortal strike effects, control, mobility, and so on. It's kind of like Pokemon. The actual best Pokemon are the ones with the best movesets and good base stats. We're going to start with all 13 classes and slowly work our way to the top 3. It's time to make our first eliminations. It's no surprise by now that Death Knight goes through some of the biggest balance swings out of any class in PvP. The story usually goes like this. At the very start of the expansion, Unholy is usually Giga Broken, with insane damage and some of the best passive defensives in the game. But then Blizzard takes out the Nerf bat, and suddenly Unholy suffers a mass extinction event. Meanwhile, Frost is just this gimmicky one-shot spec that few people want to play, except for some loyal one-tricks. So, why does DK have such insane balance swings? Well, for one, let's go back to the idea of base stats. DK is one of the only melee without a mortal strike effect, and unlike Paladin or Enhancement Shaman, it doesn't really have the utility to compensate. Instead, DK is a damage bot more than anything else, specifically designed around cleaving. Unholy Death Knights are really good at dealing damage on multiple targets stacked on the same pixel, but basically get their damage cut in half the moment people spread out. So if the numbers aren't right, DKs just kinda suck, and they will be the first class to be eliminated from our GOAT tier list. The next class we're going to eliminate might come as a surprise, Shaman. It's a shame to see one of the OGs cut so early, but the entire Shaman class has been very prone to massive balance swings over the past few years. Now, if there's one spec that has stood the test of time, it's definitely Elemental, which has been consistently good over the past few years. Enhancement and Resto, on the other hand, definitely have their moments, but more often than not, they're relatively forgettable and are rarely in the top 3 of their role. Ironically, Shaman is one of the best base toolkits for PvP, especially now. On top of Grounding, Tremor, and Earth Grab, every Shaman spec now has Lasso, Thunderstorm, and even Static Field. These are all amazing tools to have in PvP, and allow Shaman to perform its role of goalie in Arena. The only problem is that between all 3 specs, Ellie is the only one capable of performing this role consistently. The whole point of being a goalie is to divide the map in 2, having control of everyone in the arena at all times. Ellie can do this the best as a ranged DPS, since it naturally wants to be in a position to blast the entire team. Enhancement and Resto are a bit more restricted in how they can position, and as a healer, Restoration Shamans are already overloaded with a bunch of healing tasks that are hard to juggle with all of their amazing utility. Resto has also lost its crown as the most offensive healer, as now Preservation can do way more damage while also having better healing and stronger CDs. Enhance, on the other hand, provides very little upsides compared to Ellie. This is why we've seen players like Saul completely abandon the spec in tournaments despite being a one-trick player. So despite the fact that the Shaman toolkit is fairly strong, the class itself is a bit too clunky to be consistently good in PvP. Our next class facing elimination is Monk, which is also a hybrid. Let's focus on Windwalker first, since this is a spec we routinely rate as strong on our tier list. While Windwalker arguably has one of the best defensive kits in the game for any melee, and now even has a mortal strike effect, there's one thing that's held it back for multiple expansions in a row. It's the fact that the class only has 1 stun, which now only has a 3-second baseline duration. If we take a trip down memory lane, some of you might be shocked to find out that Windwalker used to have 2 stuns. One was Leg Sweep and the other was Fist of Fury, which used to do big damage while also AoE stunning anyone in its path. As a spec that is so incredibly reliant on small burst windows, only having 1 stun is a pretty big downside, which is why one of their most successful comps in recent years has actually been Windwalker Rogue of all things. This spec needs a lot of external support to carve its win condition. Mistweaver, on the other hand, has been a spec that has had an identity crisis every expansion. It's gone from being a complete totem to a pseudo-melee spec, and has now landed somewhere in between. The core issue with Mistweaver Monk is that it is very easy to punish. Mistweaver only has one real cooldown, Life Cocoon, and once it's down, a single positioning mistake can end the game. Lacking strong CDs as a healer means being entirely reliant on healing output, so monks are at the whim of Blizzard to tune their numbers appropriately. Anyway, since both monk specs have a core fundamental flaw, they're also going to be eliminated. At this point, we still have 10 classes left, but we can immediately eliminate Evoker since there really isn't enough data to call it the GOAT of PvP. Everyone still remaining on this list is still very competitive, but there are a few classes which have been coin flips in recent years. Demon Hunter is one of them. If you've been keeping track of the classes we've eliminated so far, a few of them have one thing in common, that they only have 2 viable specs in PvP. Death Knight and Monk only have 2 specs that can be good in PvP, with Blood and Brewmaster rarely ever seeing competitive play. And despite Shaman having 3 viable specs, they're all spread across 3 different roles, which means if you want to specialize in one of them, you're going to gamble each season. Demon Hunter only has 2 specs, and only one of them is ever competitive in PvP. Unlike other DPS who can swap specs within their class, DH has 1 chance of being good. The elephant in the room is that Demon Hunter has some of the highest possible peaks out of any class in PvP. There was a time in Dragonflight where DH represented over 40% of all melee spots on the top of the ladder. If you were there, you know how crazy it was to queue solo shuffle. But today, Demon Hunter feels extinct. It's a class with an incredibly strong toolkit, having almost everything you would ever need to excel in PvP. Between its control, mobility, mortal strike, and defensive bulk, DH is a class that should be good. Well, as long as the numbers can back it up. Without strong, consistent burst, it's hard for DH to make the most out of all the tools it's been given, and by only having 1 viable PvP spec, Demon Hunter is prone to having seasons in which other melee are just better pound for pound. So, despite its ability to terrorize the ladder, DH will be the next class getting eliminated from our list. Now, you would think that 4 specs would give Druid an incredible advantage in the race to GOAT of WoW PvP, but we obviously need to take Guardian out of the equation. One thing we need to admit first is that without a doubt, Cyclone is one of the best abilities ever in PvP. This single spell has defined the class for nearly 2 decades and is just one reason why, throughout history, at least one Druid spec has been number 1 within its role. Despite this, Balance, Feral, and Restoration have all had massive power fluctuations from season to season. In recent years, Feral has peaked at the very start of every expansion, which we not only saw in the War Within, but also at the start of Dragonflight, where Feral had some of the highest AoE damage in the game. But over time, we've seen Feral gradually fade away from King of the Jungle, usually coasting through the rest of the expansion as a niche, high-tier melee, but with a high enough skill floor to deter new players. Balance and Resto have the opposite problem. They usually start off the expansion slow, but then they gradually gain power in later seasons. Both of these specs scale incredibly well with stats, Resto with Mastery and Balance with Haste and Versatility, which you have in abundance by Season 3. These remaining Druid specs tend to excel later on for another reason. The game usually gets slower as the expansion progresses. Balanced Druids tend to be a damage sponge, and when damage is too high, it becomes impossible to control the game with Cyclones. As for Resto, a slower game pace allows HOTS to carry their weight, since healing over time is obviously not great when people are getting one-shot. Druid also suffers the Shaman problem. Despite having access to all 3 roles, players usually specialize in just one, so you're taking a coin flip each season if you don't want to play more than 1 spec. Unfortunately, despite having one of the best spells in PvP history, Druid won't be making it to the finish line. At this point, we still have 7 classes left, and we've already eliminated some heavy hitters, but before we reveal our top 3, we first have some honorable mentions. Up first is Paladin, a class with one distinct advantage over everyone else. Without a doubt, Paladin has the best defensive utility in the game, and this has been a theme with its design for the past few years. Paladins give their team a wall of cooldowns that the enemy has to deal with. For over a decade, the modern meta in WoW PvP has been defined in part by cooldown trading. In the arms race between offense and defense, the value of defensive cooldowns cannot be understated. Now, we know that there's going to be some of you out there who can point to 1 or 2 seasons where Paladin has been bad. And that's precisely why Paladin is simply an honorable mention and not in the top 3. There are times when Holy and Ret are B tier, but there are also times where the class completely swarms the ladder. After its rework in Dragonflight Season 1, Ret Paladin became the most popular class in PvP by far, and we saw something similar with Holy Paladin after their rework this season too. Now, the fact that both of these classes got their rework so early on in both expansions might hint at something many players don't consider. It's that Paladin is one of the most popular classes in the entire game. Whether it's good or bad, Paladins are always one of the highest represented classes in PvP. And even in Mythic Plus, Paladin still has some of the highest representation in the game for every role. We don't mean to sound like conspiracy theorists here, but there's a super low chance that Paladin ever stays bad for long, since it is Papa Blizzard's #1 customer. In fact, if there's one common theme that unites our first 3 honorable mentions, it's popularity. Because just like Paladin, Priest is always one of the most popular classes in PvP too, and is highly unique for one reason. The fact that it is the only class with 2 healing specs. Priest and Paladin share a lot in common, both from a class fantasy perspective and because of combat design. Just like Paladin, Priests are a Swiss Army knife of defensive utility for their team, but with a twist, as Discipline, Holy, and Shadow routinely play an offensive support role for their teams too. Disc and Holy have always seemed to pair well with other classes that are able to maintain offensive tempo. Psychic Scream and Dispel Magic are some of the best support tools in-game for setting up kills. Having instant cross CC with the ability to remove important buffs will always give these 2 healers a spot in CC-heavy offensive comps. Now, we do have to acknowledge the fact that it is incredibly rare for both of these specs to be high tier at the same time. And more often than not, they take turns as the meta spec for Priest healers. Shadow, on the other hand, has been incredibly consistent over the past few years and is truly one of the most unique specs in WoW. The key advantage Shadow has over most casters is the fact that there is not 1, not 2, but 3 instant cast cross CC options with AoE Fear, Blanket Silence, and Psychic Horror. This gives the spec enormous flexibility in comp selection, as it naturally pairs well with both casters and melee, but especially rogues, who enable the spec so well with all of their lockdown. And once again, because the modern metagame is married to cooldown trading, Shadow is the perfect bride thanks to all of that defensive utility, usually making it a fantastic pick for tournament players. And speaking of defensive utility, Warrior will also make it as an honorable mention. Once again, this is another class that is insanely popular every season in all forms of content. You might be thinking that Warrior suffers the Death Knight problem, only having 2 consistently viable specs for PvP. But unlike DKs, Warriors have amazing base stats. Hell, the whole term Mortal Strike, which defines several different abilities, gets its name from Warriors, with both specs having the strongest healing reduction effects in the entire game. Not to mention that the Warriors have great defensive utility and better than average mobility when it comes to melee DPS. Just like the 2 Priest healing specs, Arms and Fury usually take turns as a high tier spec in PvP, but the main reason why we're ranking Warrior as an honorable mention is because of something we've mentioned hundreds of times on this channel. Warriors are the vanilla ice cream of WoW. Their toolkit is so well balanced that they can pretty much fit in with every other DPS in the game. Does this mean that they are the best partner for everyone? Of course not, but they're rarely a bad partner to have in Arena. Our last honorable mention might seem entirely out of left field, but it's Hunter. This is a class that blurs multiple lines all at once, becoming a sum that is greater than its parts, and is the only pure DPS class that can play the ranged and melee role at the same time. Focusing first on BM and Marks, unlike every other ranged DPS in the game, you can't really call them casters, and with the exception of Demo Warlock, they're the only ranged DPS with a Mortal Strike, which is a really big deal. Having an MS is good on its own, but is even better as a ranged class, who also has some of the best control. Sure, Fury Warrior might have the strongest healing reduction in the game, but they can be limited by uptime. Mages might have better CC, but Hunters have a much easier time taking healers out of the game. These days, Hunters are even one of the tankiest classes in the game thanks to the new talent system. And even though we said we were going to focus on 3v3 and solo shuffle, we absolutely cannot ignore the fact that Hunters are always one of the best DPS in 2v2, where they've dominated the entire bracket for over a decade. And with 3 specs to choose from within the same role, there's a high chance at least one Hunter spec will be good. And when that spec is BM, it quickly overwhelms the solo shuffle ladder. But now we need to say goodbye to all of our honorable mentions, leaving us with the top 3 classes in PvP, which we will now rank one by one. At number 3 on our list is Mage. This is a class that many players have very strong feelings about, and we totally understand why. A good mage will never let you play the game, and in recent history, mage arguably hit its peak in early Shadowlands, where fire was one of the most dominant and deadliest specs of all time. At its core, what makes mage so exceptionally good in PvP is control, which as it turns out is just as important in classic WoW dungeons as it is in modern arena. In PvP, a good mage is able to dictate the pace of the game in both directions, setting up kills with polymorphs or peeling with frost novas, and everything in between. Now, something weird happened in the course of PvP history, somewhere in between classic and modern WoW. Back in the day, mage was a true glass cannon. Sure, it had great control and damage, but overall, mage was a bit more frail. But over time, the mage class became homogenized, with every spec having alter time, greater invis, and even blast wave, giving them more tools than ever to stay alive, and transitioning the class into more of a dampener than anything else. The elephant in the room is that mage has a higher skill floor than most classes, which ironically is actually a good thing. It means that Blizzard will always have a very difficult time balancing mage for competitive play, and it's one of those classes which scales insanely well with experience. To be honest, we had a very difficult time sorting number 2 and 3 on our list because in many ways they are opposite sides of the same coin. Narrowly beating mage at the top of our rankings is warlock. These two classes both represent the true wizards of WoW PvP. And with 3 DPS specs to choose from, you can almost always count on warlock being good. But why? Well, just like mages, warlocks are great at controlling the game. Spammable CC is one of the strongest mechanics in arena, and fear has a unique advantage over polymorph and cyclone in the sense that it doesn't disrupt the flow of the game nearly as much. And that's kind of the theme of warlock in general. They are easy to play with as another DPS and even as a healer. The tricky part of playing with a mage is that polymorph can be annoying to play around. It removes dots, and unless the mage is playing with a specific PvP talent, polymorph will heal the target. It's a great stalling tool, of course, but it can sometimes ruin kills by accident. Cyclone has a similar problem. A well-timed clone is the most broken CC in the game, but a bad cyclone can completely ruin a kill. Fear is a bit more neutral. Rarely does it feel disruptive. Again, that's the theme of warlock in general. They just feel good to play with. This convenience factor even applies to healers. Despite being squishy on paper, a good warlock is easy to heal, and there's never that problem of knowing where to position when teleport solves the issue for you. Warlocks are kinda like the warriors of caster DPS, they always seem to fit in. If you've been keeping score, you already know what class is coming next. For many players, this class is the villain, but we think that Rogue is best thought of as the anti-hero of WoW. Rogue has been at the forefront of PvP since its inception, and it didn't take players very long to realize that this single class had so much potential. Fast forward to the modern era, it's impossible to ignore how dominant Rogue has been in WoW's most competitive stage. There was at one point a time when Rogue was the only melee DPS played in the AWC circuit, and for good reason. Rogue is broken, but in a way most people misunderstand. The reason rogues are anti-heroes and not villains is because they make everyone else seem 10 times more overpowered. Of course, everyone has at least one experience getting soloed by a rogue in World PvP, BGs, or Arena. But the real reason Rogue is good is because it enables its team to play the game. If we had to rank every ability in PvP on a tier list, Cheap Shot would be in the top 3 without a doubt. Having a stun with no cooldown means that rogues can create 3v1 situations, allowing whatever OP wizard they are playing with to be even more OP. Having a rogue on your team is like a cheat code, but only if you know how to properly use it. You see, another elephant in the room is the fact that not only do rogues have a higher skill floor than many classes, but there's also a high skill floor to play with rogues too. What many players don't realize is that the rogue is there to make you feel OP, which means needing to respect stun DRs or even the simple act of letting them sap. And for all of you rogues out there, the number one way to get better is to realize that you are not the main character. Instead, you are the ultimate support class. If you were paying close attention, you probably noticed something about these 3 kings of PvP. All of them are pure DPS classes. It doesn't matter if one spec is bad, because you have 2 more chances to be good. It also just so happens that each one of these classes is exceptional at one thing: control. This is arguably the most important base stat of them all and is what defines WoW PvP. But we're gonna have to warn you once again that the best classes aren't always the best for beginners. Mages, warlocks, and rogues thrive off exploiting small advantages. In order to truly stand out in arenas and BGs, you're going to need strong foundational knowledge. That's why our class courses are so insanely OP for gaining rating, because they teach the fundamentals needed to actually reach your potential in easy to follow guides you won't find anywhere else. Skill-capped is our name for a reason. We have almost 15 years of experience teaching WoW PvP to over 500,000 players, helping them reach their rating goals season after season, faster than the competition. And no matter what, we will back you up with a rating gain guarantee where we promise that you will see rating gains while actively using our website. We even offer a 14-day no questions asked money-back guarantee for those of you who just want to try us out. So after this video, be sure to click the link below for an exclusive discount to get started. And that's going to be it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.